Good stuff. So, Guy, we sometimes do a did you see conversation, and I want to bring one to us today. It seems to me that I've been, whenever I turn on the radio or watch the television or catch up online, the issue of so-called COVID vaccine passports or COVID status certificates is all over the place at the moment. It's a real controversy. And it's not just, of course, a specific issue about that. It's an example of a much more broad, much more generic issue, which I think is something that is timeless in a sense. And that is that you and I would both want to argue that values really matter in leadership, that people need to know what you stand for, need to know what your values are, need to see you authentically standing up for those values, defending them, and even demonstrating them in your behavior. But I think the problem is what happens when values clash. So if I genuinely believe in civil liberties, and I do, and I thank the Almighty, that we live in a country where we have freedom of speech and freedom of expression. I can write what I like, I can say what I like by and large, and within certain broad limits, I can do as I like in many respects. I absolutely want to defend the idea of civil liberties on the one hand, but also I believe in public health. And at the moment in the pandemic, if you haven't had a vaccination, if you refuse to have a vaccination, if you don't know your COVID status, then you've no idea whether or not you are infectious to others. So I want both. And it seems to me that the debate won't go away because it's almost impossible to resolve. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's this thing about masks, for example. I don't want to wear a mask. Well, fine, but the rest of the world is wearing masks.
Yeah.
So are you willing to contribute to what society is asking you to do, in that case, regardless of your own perspective? Now, some people, I'm not talking about people that have a medical reason for not wearing a mask, take that out of the equation, but am I willing to, I don't know if it would be subjugate, maybe, but to my contribution to what we're trying to achieve, or what others perceive, or the weight of the world is trying to achieve, am I willing to go with that, even if it really rubs up against what it is that I want to do?
Yeah. We had a conversation about morality, didn't we?
Yeah.
And we talked about the difference between I and we, my rights versus my responsibilities to others. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this feels to me to be plumb center into that issue. Do I have a right to refuse a vaccination? Yes. It's not a legal requirement. But should I refuse a vaccination?
Well,
should I?
And that's interesting, because I just had a knock at the door earlier, and it was, you haven't filled your census form out.
Yeah.
So, and I don't really care.
Yeah.
I've got a million things to do. And there was a lovely person at the door. I was very polite because it's just their job. And I was, oh gosh, thank you. And I really have got better things to do than hop online and do it. Right. But society would like me to fill it out. So decisions can be made, and it might impact on my local area. So it's stuff beyond me. So again, it comes down to that. Am I acting in isolation?
Yeah.
Or am I acting from a place of contribution?
Yeah. Are you a part of this society, or are you apart from it?
Yes.
And that those two prepositions are monumentally different. It does seem to me that society only really works if we all believe we're a part of it, and that we therefore believe that we can not just take from it, but can also have to give to it. Hence, pay taxes. Would I rather not pay taxes? You bet I would. But do I think I should pay taxes? Absolutely I do. And I do pay taxes because I want to contribute, because I'm in a very fortunate position. It's appropriate that therefore that I disproportionately pay for things like, I don't know, roads and schools and, the fire service and so on. Why? Because I can, and others can even more than me, but a whole lot of people can't do as much as that. So, but together, it's better to live in a society maybe where we do share things out a bit disproportionately according to the ability to contribute.
And this is what I find it very interesting when I work within organizations and I talk about trust, accountability, bravery, and connection. And when I talk about connection, at the human level, it's eye contact and being present. But actually at that cultural / societal level, it's about contribution. Am I willing to contribute outside of my own need? And very often I can be dealing with individuals in a team who have a different perspective. Group have made a decision and the parent company has made a decision, or whatever that might be, and it outweighs the need or the want of the people at a local level. So are we as a leadership team going to do what the parent company has asked? It just might be using a performance review system. It's clunkier than ours. It's asking questions that we don't agree with. So, that's where it becomes very interesting. Are we willing to contribute outside of our own need? And there's a line somewhere where it goes from, I have a different intellectual perspective. That's much easier to go, but you know what? Then intellectually, if that's what people want me to do, I will do so. It's when it gets emotional. So if I want to go to, hey, should we go out for dinner tonight? And you go, let's go to a Chinese meal. And I go, let's go and have an Indian meal. And two other people want a different meal to me. Well, as long as I'm not allergic to it, you know what, intellectually fine. What goes around comes around. I'm sure we'll do what I want later. But it's when it becomes emotional.
It's do I agree, and it's do I care? And if I care a lot and I disagree,
yes,
we've got potential trouble. But it seems to me that the reason that this is a good conversation for us on a leadership podcast is that leaders, I think, are in that position often. So, for example, I mean, the coronavirus versus civil liberties argument is the one that's in the news at the moment, but they're always around and it's always intrinsic in most public companies. You've got shareholders who've got a reasonable claim to pounds that are generated in excess of money that needs to be spent to generate them. In other words, profit. The shareholders want the profit. Our own people want bonuses. They want the profit. The customers want lower prices, so they want the profit. And the communities in which our factories, offices, whatever they may be, exist, they want to feel that they're not being taken for granted either. So they've got a bit of a claim on the profit. So, and the problem is that any pound I give to one, I can't give to someone else. So in a sense, there's an intrinsic potential clash there, and they need constantly to be kind of traded off or balanced against each other. And my own view is that over time, certainly through my career, I think I've heard every argument now for one group being preeminent. I've heard the customer's king. I've heard you've got to look after your shareholders or they won't invest in your company. I've heard that nothing's more important than our own people. And of course, the truth is they're all right and they're all wrong. And I'm going to emphasize the bit of them all being wrong, because what's wrong, I think, is claiming that any one of those groups is preeminent over the others. The truth is that a healthy business has to keep all of those constituencies happy. Otherwise, each constituency can bite you in the bum. And it's really important to recognize, therefore, that you do have a choice with every pound of profit to lower prices, to give bonuses, to give dividends, or to invest it in the future. And there's no obvious answer. You've just got to realize that this is complex intrinsically and make a decision that you're A, prepared to defend, and B, that you're prepared to change next time around if it's not working for you.
Yeah, there's only one quote I've ever been able to remember fully. There's lots I like, and I can look them up if I have to. But the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote, which is the sign of a first-rate intelligence, is the ability to hold two opposing truths and still function. Right? It just really resonates with me, and heaven forbid I'm paraphrasing that somehow. But actually, I think in the roles that we inhabit, it's not just two opposing truths; it's multiple opposing truths. And there's what I see as being, leaders have to make decisions that I may not agree with, and I'm being paid a salary to fulfill those requirements. I mean, intellectually, I get it. but then I've got my emotional reaction to it where I'm bothered a lot. No, I'm really passionate about this. No, I'm absolutely, this is sending me over the edge. And there's some sort of an accelerator button on there somewhere that shows you, where people are. And I think, when values clash, it's different from an intellectual debate. It's different from a position. This is when you have a value, it means indicatively to me, there's a passion or an emotion connected to it. So I think when you're in a leadership role or you're a team of leaders, you're not just necessarily, and I think this is the thing which I'm also hearing of what you're saying, it's not just the fact that you're managing a story around everybody's thinking on the matter. You're having to hold people's emotional content in relation to maybe divesting that part of the company, or we're not going to be paying bonuses, and I know we said we were, or whatever it might be, and people's sometimes visceral reactions. I want to pay my people well. I want them to be engaged. But if I do that payment, it's going to hurt us over here. I've got these two clashes. What do I do?
Yeah, I maintain a distinction between what I call puzzles and problems. Puzzles might be intrinsically complex and difficult to work through and to sort out, but they're entirely contained here. They're entirely intellectual. Problems have feelings and values involved. And if you've got a puzzle that needs solving, however complex it is, and incidentally, I'm talking about really quite complex things like, curing cancer would be a puzzle. It's a puzzle. No one's feelings are involved in that. All we've got to do is work it out. We haven't worked it out yet, but there'll be a solution at some point because it's a puzzle and we will solve it ultimately.
Yes.
Now, but problems. What do you do about poverty? What do you do about hunger? What do you do about civil liberties in a time when you want to look after public health as well? These are not just intellectually complex, these are problems, not puzzles. And that really matters. And I think that's a terribly important thing. And yet it can often be, may I say, important to remember that there's also an idea in psychology called equity theory. And equity theory simply says that people expect, in a sense, to get out of any situation in proportion to what they consider to be fair, which usually is their subjective estimate of how much they put in, but it is subjective. So, and sometimes when you're trying to account for why do employees who seem to have a nice job, why do they shoplift from, why do they pilfer stuff from the stock or whatever it may be? There's this lovely euphemism in retail called shrinkage, but what it means really is theft, usually, although it can just mean food going off. But why do people do that? And often it's because they believe that they put in more than they get out, and so what they want to do is to redress that balance. And it does seem to me that what leaders often have to do is firstly make the distinction between puzzles and problems and realize when they're dealing with a problem, you can't solve it entirely intellectually. But the other thing is to realize that equity, the perceived equity and the motivation to rebalance is something which is subjectively determined by each individual. So a boss has to stay close to their people to sort of listen for those voices that say, this isn't fair. Suddenly there's this massive dividend being paid, and yet our salaries are not keeping up with the market. You've got to listen for those things, because that's a lead indicator for potential redressing of that balance later down the track.
That is fascinating, isn't it? I believe that those that are working the hardest, putting the most risk in, who come with the greatest insights, should be rewarded appropriately. But at the same time, look at the difference between what they're being paid to what I'm being paid.
Yes.
So there's these, you say you care about us. Well, you're earning X amount, so why not give some of that up? Why are you still getting a bonus when we're not? I know you achieved your targets just because so these clashes constantly exist. And I've been trying over the years, I've tried to, sitting in many a room, as I know you have, when somebody has a dilemma about their values, about what they feel is right and wrong, and getting that balance right. And I hark back to a boss that I had, Mark Jansen, fantastic boss when I was working at a company called Blue Sky. And he said to me once, I may have said this before, but he said, what's it like working for me? And he owned the organization. He was an entrepreneur. He's also an accountant by trade, incredibly intelligent guy who genuinely cared about people. And I said, it's very interesting, you genuinely care about people as human beings, but at the same time, you're happy for us to work ourselves to death. Because he was balancing, trying to keep the business afloat at some points, through to then going, hey, why shouldn't I get an earn out? I've been working on this now for over a decade. But I hugely respect people. I hugely value people. So he was constantly working the tightrope of, and you said it earlier, actually, before we press the record button, with sometimes is that dilemma between getting the best out of people and getting the most out of people.
Yes.
And how did he do it? And what I came to realize is, and I don't know if it's the answer, but it's definitely an answer, is he made hard data-driven decisions that were almost, I wouldn't say devoid of emotion, but they didn't really factor in. And when he'd made those decisions, he then reflected on what was going to happen when he told people, i.e., people will really like this, but Bob won't. Or actually, they're all going to hate this, but I need to explain why. And there was a point in that decade where it got very close to the edge financially. And he called us all into a room and laid some very hard financial truths on the table and the repercussions it would have for us. And it was horrible to hear. And I've never seen a group of people galvanized behind another human being as much as I have that.
Well, Guy, I think you may be onto a really important principle here that leaders need to embrace. And it's the principle of real openness and transparency.
Yes.
If the argument makes sense, given what you know, and it doesn't make sense to other people, maybe it's because they don't know what you know. And if when you tell them what you know, it doesn't make sense to them, maybe it shouldn't make sense to you. In other words, the transparency, the openness, let me explain what I see and how I'm weighting what I'm seeing. And let me tell you, therefore, the conclusion I've come to. In other words, let me show you my working. And then just like the maths teacher, they might say, I can see, there's the problem. You've misinterpreted that, or you've not taken this into account. So everyone then can have a say in whether the decision makes sense to them as well. Because let's face it, people who lead big organizations can make decisions that the rest of the workforce don't agree with, but they can't make many, and they can't make them for long, because at some point that will come home to haunt them. It will explode in their faces. There'll be a strike, or there'll be a mass exodus of all your best people, and you're just left with the plonkers or whatever it may. And so for me, one of the great things about good leaders, outstanding leaders even, is that they are very, very open with their arguments. They tell people what they see, how they're interpreting it, and the conclusions that they're coming to. And they keep that narrative going. And they don't mind changing their mind if the facts change. And so there's no, I think, merit in holding a poor decision just to show that you're resolute. That makes no sense at all. But changing your mind every 2 minutes doesn't make any sense either. But if you keep the narrative going and you explain to people what you're seeing and how you're seeing it, then people can always come back to you with alternative information or a different interpretation or potentially a different conclusion that you might want to consider. And that's definitely worth doing. At the moment, incidentally, I'm reading this book by Max Dupree, who used to run a company in America called Herman Miller that made high quality furniture. And he wrote a book with the title I wanted to write a book about. He called it Leadership Jazz. So the reason I'm reading it is because I want to write a book called Leadership Jazz. But his book is full of real quality wisdom about leadership. Incidentally, it's not about jazz much at all. So I think we can do a better job on that. But this book was endorsed by, for example, Bill Clinton said this book was astonishing, and Peter Drucker gave it a massive endorsement. It's a real gem of a book. And the New York Times said that his writing, Max Dupree, was like scripture because it was so kind of substantial and so serious and so worthy and so good. I do have some issues with the book like that because he doesn't cite much evidence, but boy, if you read his thoughts, they are really important. And one of the things, the chapter I've just been reading was all about what he called God's mix. He's obviously a very committed Christian, but he talked about God's mix really as a chapter about the need to respect people and their thoughts, their wishes, their values, their needs, and so on. And therefore he tied in the idea of authenticity with really genuinely valuing the people around you. And it seems to me that if you really do value people, then you will also find a reason to be transparent with them, to be open with them, to be straight with them, even like your boss, even if it hurts for them to hear the truth.
Yeah, and I think there's two or three things going on here. I think there is about having a solid decision-making methodology that you can follow that says when it is either ambiguous or I'm emotionally involved in this myself or I'm seeing the reactions that this might have, do I have a methodology that means I can work through this with a certain level of almost surgeon-like third-party review? As in, look, what I think about it's not about what I think about the patient on the table. It's about, my ability to hold to doing the right things regardless of the context that may be going on around me. Can I get to a decision? Yeah. Then there's something, and that might be that I seek counsel, it might be that I weigh things, it doesn't matter, but do you have that methodology? And then there's something about, and then if those values that I've been wrestling with are true for me, they're almost certainly true for others. So how do I take that narrative out to people? And that, back to your point, a load of hard decisions that lead nowhere, but actually then people start to trust the quality of my decision making, the honesty of my narrative. That gives me this time for this thing to pan out. And if I'm right more often than I'm wrong, then there becomes this, we've had these hard messages from Bob before. And actually, it turns out history shows us that you just got to bear with him or you got to bear with her, because more often than not, she is right, even though it's painful now. But what you will get is the honesty of the narrative as this thing continues.
Yeah, and it's even more impressive if the boss knows that there's someone else in the organization for which that is true, and that is therefore is willing to defer. So, for example, one of the best economists I've ever met was Andrew Sentence, who at one point was on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England and so on. But I met him when he was chief economist at British Airways.
Right.
And as numerate as Rod Eddington and John Rishton were at British Airways, Rod was the chief exec at the time, and Rishton was the finance director at the time. As numerate as they were, of course, when it came to macroeconomic issues, they would defer to Andrew because they trusted his judgment and they'd put him in place to be able to challenge them and to come back with an alternative point of view and so on. And that also makes sense. So I'm particularly impressed when a boss says, I have the power to drive this decision through, but I'm being advised by, albeit a subordinate of mine over here, that that's not a smart thing to do. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to listen to my junior colleague and recognize his expertise, and I'm going to be guided by that. And that seems to me to be even more meritorious. And then finally, one of the things that, I'm not usually a great fan of huge bureaucracies, but one of the things that I've valued working in a number of public sector bureaucracies, and I'm thinking particularly at the moment of the work I'm doing with the Royal College of General Practitioners, which operates largely on, it's a membership organisation, but it's got an awful lot of features which it shares with the public sector. And that is this idea of people recusing themselves in the event of a decision or a discussion in a formal decision-making body in which they've got a vested interest. So they declare, I've got a vested interest in this, so I'm going to recuse myself. And recuse simply means I'm leaving. Call me when you've finished this discussion, because you do need to resolve this. But it's not right and proper for me to chair this because it concerns me. And I've got, so that notion of recusal, I'm going to pull myself out of this decision. I'm not even going to listen to it. I'm just going to let you have a fully free and frank discussion to sort this out, because if my presence will hinder you.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because you get that it is right for me not to, because I benefit from an outcome here.
Yeah. Yeah. Incidentally, I don't hear that very much in private sector bodies. I don't hear that.
That's just where I was going, because actually the decisions that we make may be linked to our potential to earn bonus, or it might be a decision for, yes, we call it streamlining the business.
Yep.
That might be to the eyes of others another way of going, yes, increasing profit, because if you hit that bottom line, you hit that, you hit that bonus payout, and you go, yes, well, what's wrong with that? I'm making us leaner. And it's very interesting that, I am emotionally invested in this, but that's why it's driving me to make the hard decisions.
Yes.
And I think it's when values clash is an interesting one, because I think actually there are almost two things going on here on reflection for me. One is there are me recognizing that I'm holding multiple truths. I value people, but I also value the fact that I'm good at doing this job and making it cost effective, blah, blah, blah. So I hold those two truths, and clashing might be interesting, but they're always at battle with each other. I've got human beings, so I've got the human doing. I need to get the most out of people, but I need to treat people with respect and not leave them damaged. Gosh, how do I do that? So these things are always there. And then I think maybe there are the things that it's not straightforward for me. I don't want to I like this person, for example, I don't want to let them go. Maybe this is somewhere else in the business I could put them. They've been here 30 years. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. Yeah. But the business has outgrown them. Oh, they've only got a few years left before they retire. Surely we can put them somewhere quiet. Yeah. And you go, well, no, you can't, because actually, if we're doing that on a larger scale, we're keeping people of a certain age and a certain experience. We're not making way for the talent, which means I understand it's easy now, but within 5 years, that's going to cause us a problem.
Yeah, the problem is unintended consequences, isn't it?
It's when the values clash and it creates an anxiety in me or in others around me, because I think there are ones that you just manage because that's kind of the level that you're operating at. Yes. And then there are ones that you're letting the tail's wagging the dog on this one. Yeah. And it's stopping.
But I think also, though, if you've got one of these dilemmas, I think for me, I get to a very simple conclusion, I think, is that by and large, if you can state what the dilemma is, and you can say it out loud to the people that you're working with, usually you can get their brains involved in trying to help you solve the problem as well.
Yeah.
So at the moment, the government is quite clearly trying to get the news media to talk a lot about vaccine passports so they can listen to the debate. And the debate, as I hear it at the moment, is the civil libertarians say, and by the way, and the problem is that when the government takes away any one of our civil liberties, they're very, very, very bad at giving it back.
Giving them back, right? Yeah.
So it shrinks our freedom, and permanently. And so, of course, the obvious answer is to say, well, okay, if we need vaccine passports, what we'll do is we'll create them, but only for 18 months or 2 years or something. We'll time limit it right from the start, and we'll stop it absolutely on time, as we promised we would. So And that's come, I think, out of the debate. They weren't talking about time-limited vaccine passports. They were just talking about vaccine passports. As the civil libertarians and that group of Tory MPs who are starting to kick back against the Prime Minister on this subject, they're the ones saying, and of course, once they take it away, they won't give it back. Okay. So that gives a clue as to how we might be able to ameliorate their objections to the proposition. And so it seems to me that the big mistake that often leaders make when they've got a dilemma is they keep it to themselves in the false belief that somehow people therefore don't know about it. Well, of course we know about it. But the second thing is in the belief that somehow they should solve it before they bring it out into the open. And of course, the chances are, if they'd been able to solve it, they'd have done it by now. So my view is share the dilemmas, share the values clashes, explain. And if at the end of the day, there is no logically, totally defensible position, then you might just need to ask for forgiveness and make a decision anyway.
And I think that's what this comes down to. There's quite a few variables here. One is the one that, this is a difficult decision. I'm a leader. I'm a person of seniority. I'll make my decision. Then there's the values where it's not just me struggling here. This is a truth amongst my people. There's multiple camps here. There's different opinions, be it societal, be it within the organization. Some people will get it, some people won't. Some people will think it's a good idea, some people won't. So bring that narrative where you can, almost to people, so they can be part of that journey. And when we get to a decision, they feel involved, even if they may not agree. They've been party to the conversation. They've changed the nature of the conversation through their inputs. And then there just comes a point where I or we are in charge, and we've got to make a decision in a timely manner that may carry levels of either discomfort or, we can't necessarily, nor should we necessarily be trying to get everybody to be comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But maybe what the answer is you may not be comfortable with the decision, but if you can be comfortable with the fact that we've decided the right way, that might be something that says that's maybe an important factor.
But maybe you mean using the right process rather than making the right decision.
Yeah, this thing that you do like this time, but you don't like this time. What you can trust, even if you don't trust the decision that we've made, I don't think it's the right one. I do trust that you listened. I do trust that you have a way of making decisions. I know, so I can trust maybe the process, the manner of it, the way you've narrated the thinking behind it. You've accepted.
But I think you've hinted at another factor here, though, and that is that even if you make a decision, if you're my boss, you make a decision for or maybe you're the chief exec and you make a decision for our company that I fundamentally disagree with. I've got a choice. I could leave, but that may be easier said than done because it might be a tough labor market. I could stick around and grumble about it. But my guess is that if I stick around and am prepared to give you the benefit of the doubt, it will happen because you've been open about the difficulty of the decision. You've been open about how you've made it. But the third thing is you've not treated anyone like an idiot. You've shown respect to us all. You've explained, you've been open, you've been forthright, you've listened, but because a decision needs to be taken and not everyone can be happy about this, you've explained why you've decided A rather than B. If people believe that they've been heard, that's usually okay. No one expects in a big organization to have a veto, but they do expect to have a voice. If you take the voice away, you create resentment and people won't support the decision. But the other thing is that if you've treated us with respect enough to listen and to give us a voice and to explain, then usually I think people will give you the right to make that decision.
Yeah. And I think when we come back to the start of this, which is, what happens when values clash, the reason that maybe that was the title there was, it's not just about whether or not I agree or disagree with an inherently tier one decision. It's when it's when it's something that I have that connection to at an emotional level. So I think you're right. You're the boss. There's a reason there's a hierarchy here. It is not, I am not the decision maker. Susan is, Bob is ultimately. So what have I got to believe in? What do I have to say? If they're right, so be it. And if I'm wrong, well, that'll show me, won't it? But even if it turns out that they are wrong, what would stop me from not losing my faith in them and my willingness to contribute and be connected, even if it turns out I'm right? And maybe that's because the things that you said, I've been listened to and heard. I know I don't have veto, but I think there's a genuineness in the manner of the way in which, and not if you've got 20,000 employees, it's not that you can have consultations for every single thing, but there's a sense that I've heard that you've heard. And if I had been at the table, I would have made that point, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it's how you get that across. And actually, the one thing I probably want to, from my position, close on is that's pretty easy when you're running a relatively small organization. But when you've got, and a lot of the organizations that you and I deal with, they are international, they are global, they are around the world. And there's a huge investment of energy if you're going to explain yourself. And easy when everybody's in the same office. Can I just have a huddle for a minute? Off we go. But if I'm going to explain myself to this organization, and if we're big enough that narrative then may be shared publicly, that fear of going beyond the vanilla, this call might be recorded, this message may be sent to the press. So it's not that I don't understand about offering explanations to the world, but I then may fear that if they go beyond anything that's generic or vanilla, then these things might be seen as weakness, or they might be seen or interpreted in different ways. And I think that's when we start to get organizations making decisions that are sometimes geared around the interpretation they may get rather than what might actually be the right decision.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other story.
Yeah. I've made a big thing about really being open and transparent with information. I also believe in making sure that happens. If that's what you believe in, then you need to build it firmly into your organization. And I don't remember the details of this story, but I do remember hearing the story of a particular army general who would say to his first line commanders, make sure everybody hears this. Yeah. And fairly early on in his tenure of commanding his battalion or whatever it was he commanded, he would then go the next day out and find 3 or 4 different privates, as junior as they could be, and said, have you heard about whatever it was he'd told his commanders to make sure everyone heard about? Have you heard about it? And those who said, yes, sir, I heard about that. Yes, my platoon commander told me about it. He'd say, good, fine. Then he'd find a private who said, no, I haven't heard about that, sir. He said, okay, who's your platoon commander? He'd find the platoon commander. He'd say, have you heard about this? And if the platoon commander said, no, I haven't heard about this, he said, okay. And he'd go to the captain, have you heard about this? Yes. Did you hear that I wanted everyone to hear about this? Yes. Well, how come you're, and he'd deliberately go round and say, why didn't you do what I asked, which is to tell everybody about this? Because it really matters that we're open about the information we can share. So what I'd say is, don't leave it to chance. Make sure these things happen.
So I like that. And I think my closing kind of line then is, look, as a team, as an individual, there are constantly challenging decisions that need to be made for oneself and for others and for the organization. So the good practice, the competence, the methodology of making decisions needs to be there. If you don't have the competence on making a decision, then that's going to be its own problem. But actually, it's recognizing that if this has got emotional angst built into the decision-making process because people's values, what they believe in, what they think is right and true, if that's going to be something that's going to be real for me and others, then there's another process, there's another set of expectations, which will be taking that story out and taking it deep. And that is actually another episode that I think that we have lined up, which is what does or doesn't prevent messages from getting through organizations. And that might be a great one for us to pick up on. But making the decision is one thing, getting the darn thing out is another.
Yeah. So my feeling is, if you're caught on the horns of the dilemma as a leader, explain the dilemma, invite people's contributions to it, and then decide. But don't decide until you've done those first two things.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, on that note, I shall call it a wrap, and we'll see each other sooner rather than later.
See you soon.